My name is Daniel, and I've seen more of life's edges than most people care to imagine. Just a few years ago, I was an architect. I designed buildings that touched the sky, thinking I was invincible. But fate has a way of humbling the proud. A car crash took my wife and daughter, leaving me with nothing but a shattered heart and mounting medical bills. Before I knew it, the life I'd built crumbled into dust. Now, I live on the streets of New York City, a ghost among the bustling crowds. Winter was closing in when she appeared. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Her name, I later learned, was Samantha. She stopped in front of me one afternoon, her polished heels clicking against the pavement. She was everything I was not: poised, confident, and successful. I'd seen people like her before, the kind who avoid eye contact, rushing past as if poverty were contagious. But Samantha did something different. She noticed me. It started with a cup of tea. I remember the warmth spreading through my fingers as I held it, the steam curling into the crisp November air. She stood there for a moment, her gaze lingering. I wondered what she saw: a man who had lost everything, or a curiosity she couldn't quite place. She didn't stay long that first time, but something about her presence lingered, like an echo in an empty room. Over the weeks that followed, she came back. Each time, she brought something small: a coffee, a sandwich, once even a scarf. At first, I thought it was pity, but her actions felt different. She'd sit on the bench near mine, her posture elegant yet restless, as if she were trying to escape her own thoughts. I began to notice the cracks in her perfect facade. Her eyes, though sharp and blue, carried a weight I recognized. A kind of loneliness that doesn't fade, no matter how many people surround you. She started to talk, and I started to listen. Samantha's life sounded like a dream from the outside. A high-powered career, a wealthy boyfriend, and a lifestyle most would envy. But as she spoke, I could hear the emptiness in her words. Her boyfriend, Jason, was controlling and shallow, more interested in appearances than substance. Her job, while prestigious, left her drained and questioning her purpose. I didn't offer advice. I had none to give. Instead, I shared my own story: how I'd lost my family, my home, and my identity. Somehow, in the telling, the pain felt a little lighter. By Christmas, our conversations had become a lifeline for both of us. She'd laugh sometimes, a sound so genuine it seemed to catch her off guard. I hadn't felt that kind of connection in years. And then, on New Year's Eve, everything changed. I hadn't expected to see her that night. She arrived at my usual spot, her face flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. She told me she'd left a party after an argument. There was a tension in her movements, a vulnerability that drew her closer to me. We sat in silence for a while, the city's fireworks bursting in the distance. And then, against all reason or logic, it happened. In that moment, we were two souls stripped of pretense, seeking solace in the unlikeliest of places. Weeks passed, and I didn't see her. I told myself it was for the best. What could I possibly offer someone like her? But when she finally returned, I knew something was different. Her face was pale, her expression distant. She avoided my gaze as she handed me a paper bag with a sandwich. As I unwrapped it, she spoke softly, almost to herself. She was pregnant, and I knew, without her needing to say it, that the child was mine. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than any burden I'd carried before. Samantha's world, so meticulously constructed, was about to collide with mine, and neither of us would emerge unscathed. The days after Samantha told me about the pregnancy were a blur. The weight of her revelation pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. She didn't say much, and neither did I. Words felt too fragile, too insignificant for the enormity of what had happened. Still, I couldn't escape the pull I felt toward her, even as my mind screamed that this connection between us was doomed from the start. She came back to see me the next week. Her steps were hesitant, as though she was trying to reconcile her polished world with the chaos she'd invited into it. That day, she didn't bring coffee or sandwiches. Instead, she brought herself, stripped of the careful armor she usually wore. We walked aimlessly through the park, the cold air biting at our faces. I could feel the tension in her, a storm brewing just beneath her composed exterior. "I can't stop thinking about that night," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. I didn't respond, unsure if she was confessing or accusing. It didn't matter. I'd been thinking about it too. I remembered the way her breath had hitched when our hands brushed, the softness of her skin against mine, the way the world had faded into nothing but us. That night had been a fleeting escape, a moment when two broken people found solace in each other. The more time we spent together, the more the boundaries between us blurred. Her visits became more frequent, and the conversations deeper. She began to share pieces of herself she'd kept hidden from everyone else. Samantha wasn't just a woman of success and ambition. She was someone searching for meaning, for connection, for a way to feel alive. And somehow she'd found that in me. A man who had nothing to offer but honesty. I'd be lying if I said I didn't crave her. There was something electric in the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. Something magnetic in the way she leaned closer, as if drawn by a force she couldn't explain. Every touch, every stolen glance, felt like crossing an invisible line. And then there were the nights where we let go of the world entirely. She would find me late in the evening, when the city was quieter, and the streets seemed to belong to us alone. We'd retreat to my makeshift corner of the world, a forgotten alley with just enough space to feel private. There, under the dim glow of a street lamp, we'd let the barriers fall. Her lips would find mine, urgent and hungry, as if trying to erase the doubts and fears that clung to us both. Her hands would trace the lines of my face, my chest, my shoulders, as though memorizing the parts of me she'd never expected to want. Those moments were raw and unguarded. Her touch was both tender and desperate, a contradiction that mirrored our situation. I felt her breath against my neck, her heart racing beneath my fingertips, her body molding against mine like we were made to fit together. She'd whisper my name, not Daniel the homeless man, but Daniel the man who made her feel seen. And then, just as quickly as the night consumed us, dawn would break and reality would return. She'd pull away, guilt flashing in her eyes, though she never spoke of regret. Instead, she'd linger for a moment, her fingers brushing mine, as if reluctant to let go. And I, a man who had lost everything, would watch her walk away, knowing she'd return and that I'd let her. Because no matter how impossible our connection seemed, it was the only thing that felt real. As winter turned to spring, our world grew more complicated. The pregnancy was no longer an abstract idea but a tangible reality. Her body began to change, and with it, so did the stakes. Samantha's perfect life was beginning to crack under the pressure, and I couldn't help but feel responsible. Yet I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. She was the light in my otherwise dark existence, and I was the escape she didn't know she needed. But even as we clung to each other, I knew it couldn't last. The world wasn't kind to people like us, to stories like ours. Samantha was already starting to unravel, her carefully curated life spiraling out of control. And I, a man who had nothing left to lose, feared the day she'd realize she couldn't hold on to me forever. The pull between us became impossible to resist. By now, Samantha was visiting almost daily, and each encounter seemed to intensify the tension that neither of us could escape. Her polished world had started to unravel. She admitted as much in her silence, in the way she'd sit beside me, her body so close that her warmth seeped through my thin coat. The air between us was thick with unspoken truths, and when her hand finally brushed mine, it was as though the dam broke. That night was different. The city had grown quiet, the streets damp from a passing rain. Samantha found me in the alley where we'd grown accustomed to hiding from the world. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her eyes carried the weight of everything she felt but couldn't say. The world outside ceased to matter as she stepped closer, her breath hitching as she reached for me. Her lips met mine with a desperation that took my breath away. This wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a collision of need, raw and unfiltered. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as if the space between us was unbearable. My fingers traced the curves of her body, learning the lines of her silhouette in the dim light of the street lamp. She pressed against me, her body aflame igniting something long dormant inside me. We didn't have a bed or a home, but none of that mattered. The world shrank to just the two of us, tangled together in a moment that defied reason. Her skin was soft under my touch, her breath warm against my neck. The intensity of her movements spoke of a hunger that matched my own, a need to feel alive in a way that transcended the chaos of our lives. Samantha's control, the armor she wore so carefully in her professional world, crumbled in my arms. She surrendered completely, her vulnerability laid bare as we crossed every boundary we'd silently agreed to ignore. The city around us faded into nothingness, replaced by the rhythm of our bodies and the unspoken promises we made with every touch. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. Her fingers gripped my shoulders, her nails digging into my skin as if anchoring herself in the moment. I memorized every sound she made, every whispered breath that escaped her lips. And when she collapsed against me, her heartbeat echoing mine, it felt as though we'd carved out a sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. The aftermath was quiet. Samantha lay beside me, her head resting on my chest, her hair cascading over my shoulder. The world outside began to seep back in, the distant hum of traffic, the cool breeze brushing against our skin. But for that moment we existed in a space that belonged only to us. Her hand traced idle patterns across my chest, her touch light and absent-minded, as though she were trying to etch the memory into her mind. When she finally sat up, her expression was unreadable. She gathered her coat around her shoulders, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a heavy fog. I wanted to speak, to say something that might anchor her to me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched as she walked away, her steps slower than usual, her head bowed against the chill of the night. The memory of her lingered long after she disappeared from view. I replayed every moment, every touch, every breath, unable to let it go. But beneath the euphoria was a gnawing sense of dread. Samantha's life was already precarious, and what we'd done would only complicate things further. I knew she'd return, but I also knew the price of her visits was growing steeper, for both of us. As the days passed, I found myself questioning everything. Could we sustain this connection, this fragile sanctuary we'd built in the shadows of the city? Or would it collapse under the weight of reality? The answers eluded me, but one thing was certain. I couldn't let her go no matter the cost. The days after that night were a haze of conflicting emotions. Samantha returned, as I knew she would, but something in her had shifted. Her usual composure was frayed, her movements slower, her gaze heavier. She carried the weight of what we'd done in her posture, and yet she kept coming back. Each time, she brought with her a storm of feelings, longing, guilt, and an unspoken fear that neither of us dared to address. She would find me in the evenings, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of how precarious our bond had become. We'd sit together in silence more often than not, the unspoken tension between us thicker than the city's winter air. I could feel her struggling with the duality of her life, torn between the world she came from and the one she'd found with me. The lines between those worlds were blurring, and it scared her. Scared me too. One evening, she arrived wearing a coat that barely hid the curve of her growing belly. She sat beside me on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes scanned the horizon, avoiding mine. The reality of her situation crashed down on me with an unspoken heaviness that filled the space between us. Her world was spiraling further into chaos, and I was at the center of it. The child she carried was mine, but she was letting another man claim it. I understood why. She was trying to maintain the life she'd built, to keep the illusion intact. But it didn't make it any easier to bear. The nights we spent together grew more fraught with tension. The intimacy we shared became both a refuge and a source of pain. She'd press herself against me, her body trembling as if trying to forget everything outside our little world. I'd hold her close, my hands tracing the contours of her back, her shoulders, her face. But no matter how deeply we connected in those moments, reality always loomed over us like a shadow. As we lay tangled in the darkness, Her presence was both grounding and suffocating. I wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that we'd find a way to make it work. But the truth was, I didn't know if we could. Samantha's world was crumbling, and I was afraid I'd only drag her down further. The following days brought a new tension to our encounters. She became more distant, her visits shorter, her touches less certain. I could feel her pulling away, and it terrified me. I'd grown dependent on her presence, on the hope she represented. Without her, I'd be nothing more than a man lost in the shadows. Then, one evening, she didn't come. I waited for hours, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When she finally appeared the next night, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside me and stared at the ground. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and it struck a chord deep within me. Jason wasn't just a name anymore. He was a threat, a force that could tear us apart. She stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the ache of her absence. I watched her disappear into the night, the weight of her actions settling over me like a heavy fog. The bond we'd built was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. All I could do was wait and hope that Samantha would find her way back to me. The air between us was electric, charged with a mix of longing and despair that neither of us could fully articulate. Samantha's visits became erratic, each one an unspoken negotiation between her guilt and desire. Her eyes betrayed her turmoil, but her touch told a different story. She was desperate, clinging to the fragile world we'd built together even as it crumbled beneath us. One night, the intensity reached its peak. The city was quiet, cloaked in the stillness that only comes in the darkest hours. Samantha arrived looking like a woman on the edge of a precipice. Her face was pale, her movements jittery, and her gaze darted around as if she expected someone to be watching. When she entered, the tension in the room was unbearable. I could see the storm brewing within her, a maelstrom of emotions she had no words for. She reached for me, her hands trembling, and in that moment, words felt unnecessary. The physicality of our connection spoke volumes, of need, of defiance, of the pain we both carried. What followed was raw, unrestrained, and unlike anything we'd shared before. It wasn't just passion. It was an eruption of everything we'd been suppressing. The unspoken fears, the secrets, the lies. They all came pouring out in a moment of pure, unfiltered intimacy. It was as if we were trying to outrun the consequences of our actions, to lose ourselves in each other and forget the world outside. But the aftermath was as brutal as the moment was consuming. Samantha lay beside me, her breathing ragged, her body tense. The weight of what we'd done seemed to press down on her like an unbearable burden. I reached out to comfort her, but she recoiled, her expression unreadable. She sat up, pulling the sheets around her like a shield. Her back was to me, and the silence in the room was deafening. When she finally turned, her eyes were filled with a mix of anger, regret, and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Without a word, she dressed and left, the echo of her departure lingering long after the door closed behind her. The days that followed were excruciating. Samantha didn't return, and the void she left behind was suffocating. I replayed that night over and over in my mind, searching for answers, for signs of what had gone wrong. But all I found was the growing realization that our fragile bond might have finally shattered. I wandered the city aimlessly, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to find some indication that she was still a part of my world. But she was gone, and with her the hope that had sustained me. I was left with nothing but questions and the hollow ache of her absence. The reality of our situation was inescapable. Samantha was tied to a life I could never be a part of, a life that demanded sacrifices neither of us were willing to make. The child she carried was a constant reminder of the choices we'd made, the paths we'd taken, and now it seemed those paths were diverging for good. I tried to focus on survival, to distract myself from the pain of losing her. But every corner of the city, every quiet moment, brought memories of her rushing back. The sound of her laughter, the touch of her hand, the way she looked at me when she thought no one else was watching. They haunted me, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. And then, just as I began to accept that she was gone, she reappeared. It was late, and I was sitting in the same spot where we'd first met. She approached cautiously, her face drawn, her eyes shadowed by something deeper than exhaustion. Without a word, she sat beside me, her presence both a comfort and a torment. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twisting nervously. I waited, unsure of what to say, unsure of what she wanted. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she turned to me, her expression unreadable, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. The calm before the storm didn't last long. Samantha's return was the catalyst for everything to spiral out of control. I could sense it in her demeanor, the way her eyes darted around, the way her words were clipped and careful. She wasn't just battling her emotions anymore. She was running from something, or someone. It started with a shadow, a figure lurking at the edges of my vision, always a step behind but never close enough to confront. At first, I thought it was paranoia, the product of sleepless nights and a mind worn thin by worry. But then the shadows took form. A man. His face was sharp, his eyes cold, and his presence unmistakable. Jason. He didn't approach me outright. Instead, he circled, watching, waiting. His tactics were methodical, designed to unnerve me, to remind me of the imbalance of power between us. He had resources, connections, the kind of influence that could crush me with a single phone call. But he didn't need to act openly. His silence was a weapon, his presence a threat. Samantha's visits became frantic, her words rushed, her actions desperate. She admitted that Jason had begun asking questions, piecing together fragments of her double life. He'd seen her disappear too many nights, return home too many mornings with excuses that no longer held weight. The charade was crumbling, and Jason wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. It happened suddenly, as these things often do. I was sitting on the same bench where Samantha and I had built our fragile connection, staring at the horizon as the city buzzed around me. I didn't hear him approach, but I felt his presence, an oppressive weight that settled over me like a storm cloud. Jason stood before me, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to introduce himself. I knew who he was, and he knew everything about me. "You thought you could take what's mine," he said, his voice low but laced with venom. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his hand gripping my collar. He pulled me to my feet, his strength undeniable, his intentions clear. I braced for a blow, but it didn't come. Instead, he let go, shoving me backward with enough force to send me stumbling. "This isn't over," he said, his words a promise rather than a threat. He turned and walked away, leaving me shaken but unbroken. For now, the escalation was swift. Jason's reach extended beyond what I could comprehend. He had eyes everywhere, his influence infecting every corner of my world. Samantha was caught in the middle, a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. She tried to protect me, to shield me from Jason's wrath, but her efforts only seemed to fuel his anger. One night, I returned to my usual spot to find it empty. No Samantha, no familiar comforts. Just silence. As I turned to leave, a car screeched to a halt beside me. Two men stepped out, their faces masked, their intentions clear. They grabbed me before I could react, dragging me into the car. My struggles were futile. Their grip was unrelenting. I was taken to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its interior as cold and unyielding as Jason's gaze when he entered. He didn't waste time with words. His fist spoke for him, each blow a reminder of the lines I'd crossed. Pain blurred the edges of my vision, but I held on, refusing to give him the satisfaction of breaking me. Samantha burst in like a force of nature, her voice cutting through the chaos. She begged Jason to stop, her words falling on deaf ears. But her presence was enough to disrupt his focus, giving me the opening I needed. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him, knocking him off balance. The ensuing chaos was a blur of motion and sound, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. In the end, it wasn't strength that saved me. It was resolve. Jason underestimated the power of a man with nothing left to lose. When the dust settled, he was on the ground, his breath labored, his control shattered. Samantha and I fled, the city lights fading behind us as we disappeared into the night. But escape was only the beginning.